Hello and welcome to Season 5, Episode 2 of Solely Singleton. I'm your host, Brad. This is my co-host, Eric.
How's it going?
We've got a very important episode for you guys today. We've had a lot of people who are newer to cubing asking us questions about where to put money in their new cubes, whether they started off with the board game cube or a CK cube or some hodgepodge of cards they already owned. A common question is, what do I do now? Like, where do I go from here with the basic... I know there's a lot of problems with my list, but I don't know how to take it forward, where to spend my money to actually get the most out of it so that I'm not making more mistakes.
Yeah.
Yes, this is hopefully a tool we'll be able to link to further down the line that should be pretty timeless. We're not going to use too many key examples of like flavor of the week cards. It's going to be more of a short guideline episode about where you should be putting money early on in a cube to get the most balanced impact on your format for the money you're spending.
Right. And I think a lot of the stuff that we're going to be saying is actually pretty generic in terms of investing into Magic in general. The stuff that we talk about here kind of works in every format of Magic, no matter if it's standard or EDH or whatever, to a degree. I mean, if you're getting into vintage, well, sorry, budget is not really a thing.
Right. This is going to be one of those single point, shorter episodes. So let's hop into that as our only topic this week.
Sounds good.
So, Eric, we both learned from the greats when we were learning how to cube. What would Anthony Avatolo tell you is the key thing to do in cube in order to enjoy yourself during a draft?
Yeah, it's draft your lands, kids. And yeah, I've potentially taken it a bit too far.
There's no such thing.
Well, when you get to you're done with pack 1 and you only have 4 non-lands, maybe you have a problem. But otherwise, maybe you can cast everything in pack 2 and pack 3. I don't know. But yeah, lands, big deal. If you
Yes,
can't...
and lands are usually one of the more expensive things in Magic when it comes to a effect to cost ratio.
Right, and I think that's because everybody eventually learns that if you can't cast your spells, they're not worth it.
Yeah.
And to be able to cast your spells, you need lands. And if you're going to play more than one color, well, you have to have dual lands or tri-lands or whatever.
So when it comes to lands, it's hard to tell you which lands to get. It depends entirely on what lands you started with in your cube, what your budget for the update is, what the target power level for your cube is.
Yeah, and it does depend a lot on if you're starting from nowhere. Like if you don't really have a collection or you're starting from scratch of this is a new cube, that's going to be different than like if you already sort of have a cube and you're trying to look to do some updates. So these are like, different things that you're going to look at.
In general, though, we have our personal land rankings that we did last year on the show. We'll link you to the Google Doc in which we ranked them, but it's going to be a personal thing for your cube as to which ones you go into. I would recommend things like a check pane manland mixed with fast land mixed with the half cycle of lands like the bicycle lands from Amonkhet. If you combine those, power level wise, you should be able to get a good core land base that, while it's not as good as the classic dual fetch shock of an unlimited budget cube, it's going to be a good starting point that's infinitely better than coming to play tap lands and things like that.
Yeah, and I think that's the big thing that, we want to take away on this is like there's a cost benefit that you have to weigh. So like your dual land, yeah, it's great. Your fetch lands, yeah, they're great. But some of those dual lands cost $600. Some of the fetch lands cost $150 or whatever insane amount they're at right now, or $100. And yeah, they're the best. We're not going to deny that. But are they hundreds of dollars better than, like you said, the check lands and the fast lands or whatever? And realistically, if you're on a budget, no.
Yeah, I think one of the key things we can push in this episode as an idea is the worst thing you can do when you have a limited budget for an update is to blow the entire budget on a single card of a high power level, like putting Jace the Mind Sculptor in your $100 cube, that will completely imbalance the format while blowing your entire budget on a single Magic card. Another thing that can go wrong is buying a single high-cost item that doesn't impact the cube very much, something like Force of Will, which is an alright role player. It's a fine Magic card. I think we all know Force of Will is good, but it's pretty low impact from a cube design standpoint, and it's going to cost a lot of budget compared to most other cards.
Yeah, that's kind of that's a big deal actually. I love the Force of Will example because it is one of those that it's a pretty iconic card just because it's seen so much like legacy play.
Yes, an iconic card with a classic effect, which is something we're going to recommend adding momentarily here. But the impact to cost ratio is horrible for it.
Right. And that is one of those things like the adding Force of Will is not going to change the cube draft that much. And it's quite an expensive card. So if you have the money, well, I mean, this episode really isn't for you if you don't have a budget that you have to stick to. But
write blank checks.
Yeah. But like if you're looking at budget stuff, these cards that seem awesome and they're really iconic and they're cool, they're just not powerful enough to actually like change the cube. And if they are powerful enough to change the cube, then you're destroying the balance of the entire cube because that one card is so much stronger.
So instead of that, other than the lands, where are we recommending people spend money to start with? Like the really core stuff that you should be looking to instead of these high cost, low impact, or high cost, unbalanced cards.
Right. So the big thing with cubes is you want to create a format that has archetypes. So it's not just a bunch of mid-range decks that are, smashing up against each other. You want to actually make a defining archetype.
To give a good example of this, let's look at famously good draft formats outside of Cube. Things like Innistrad Draft, the classic example, right, where you have the travel prep deck. You have the spider spawning deck.
Right.
You've got decks that you can plan for in a draft, and you go, I really want to go this direction. I found this pack one. I think I'm going to try pushing in this direction and see if it pays off, or see if I have to mutate into a different deck because I'm getting signals saying to. That's the key to a good balanced draft format. It's not just a pile of cards in a box.
And it's not even the key to just a good balance, and it is, but it's also the key to having an entertaining and fun format.
One that's easily repeatable for you and your friends long term.
Right, because I can make a balanced experience with just mid-range. That doesn't mean it's going to be fun if you do it, if you draft that cube 10 times in a month.
Or even 10 times in a year.
Right.
I have a feeling I'd rather just go draft the new Magic set at that point.
Right. And that is one of those things is you can see that Wizards understands this as well, because a lot of the sets that they release, there are archetypes that they're trying to push as here's a cool thing that you can do. Obviously, you can still play mid-range because that's just something that's part of Magic.
And there's usually sub-ways to play mid-range.
Right. But if you want to have some interesting, unique fun, well, here's an archetype that we've had, if we've added into this draft. So it's one of those that that's just a defining part of cubes and cube design in general. And if we're trying to accomplish that, but we still have a budget that we have to keep in mind, then you have to find the archetypes that you can actually support with a budget. So that means finding the key cards that actually make that archetype a possibility. So if, for example, you're doing Reanimator, well, key cards are going to be your Reanimate cards and the targets for reanimating.
And discard outlet.
So you have to actually look at those and go, can I afford the cards that are necessary to make that archetype at my budget?
And I would say a key thing to consider is, are you adding your fourth archetype to blue when your green lacks any archetype in general, or your white is still a mid-range pile?
Yeah.
Can you be fixing up certain colors that are problems to your cube drafters, instead of continuing to do cool things in a color that doesn't really need the help right now, or even cool things for a subcategory like different variants on control decks that don't really need the help because people already like those. No one's really enjoying mid-range or aggro right now. What can you do? Add a token theme in, add in more stacks cards.
Yeah, definitely. And that's, another one of those reasons that we were looking at the Artifact aggro package, because it was let's kind of look at what we can do to spice aggro up a little bit.
Right, and I would say to look at things like key single cards you can pick up that may enable entire archetypes. Like, let's say, for instance, Sneak Attack and Show and Tell. If you've got, let's say, a $50 budget, you can in fact buy only 2 cards and have a big impact on your cube by adding an entire deck. If you already supported things like Ramp or Reanimate, suddenly these 2 cards open up the Cheat into Play deck instead of just a pure Ramp deck. So now you've got a new variant of a deck. You only added 2 cards to the cube. You may need to add a couple more secondary versions of these effects, obviously, long term, but these couple of cards can enable an entire combo deck to suddenly appear. So you don't need a high card count as long as the ones you add are impactful, but in a balanced way for your cube's power level, not Jace in a $100 budget cube.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that's another thing is like Jace is just a generically good card, but it's not, there's no archetype that's necessary. Like, it doesn't create the ability to have a control deck. It's just good.
Aside from the archetype defining cards, I think another key thing we want to talk about is people enjoy classics. They love classic effects.
Yeah.
Things like Counterspell, Lightning Bolt, the easily identified core items in Magic that everyone can point to and tell you what the card does if they've been playing more than 6 months to a year.
Yeah, these are the cards that everybody... So if a new card comes out that's even remotely close to it, they'll be like, oh, that's the Lightning Bolt variant, or that's the Counterspell of this format. And
right.
There's a reason that people always talk that way. It's just because they're iconic and people love seeing those just because they're talked about so much. And I think that's something that with the original board game cube, it was like a lot of those, like the Lightning Bolt, Counterspell, they were expensive for the budget, and it's hard to actually justify it just because, they're not archetype defining. Like, there's plenty of Counterspell and Lightning Bolt variants that are not quite as good, but good enough, that are like really cheap. But there is something that after you draft the format a few times, it feels like there's something kind of missing, or more that when you add those in, you'll feel like there's something special that's been added, even though if you like empirically look at it, it's not anything special.
Right. And this is for the more base level stuff. Like, let's say you're a poor group of college kids. Your $20 update is a big deal to you. You might have a couple cards from the new set that came out that you're going to be adding because you happen to open it from a pack you grabbed at Walmart when you were grabbing food because you decided to live on ramen this week instead.
Yeah.
We've all been there. But for people on that extreme budget, this might be a really good way to spend that $20, is on things like grabbing yourself a Swords to Plowshares, a Lightning Bolt, Counterspell, things that are going to cost you a couple bucks a pop, but they won't be super high impact on a single card level to the cube's power level, but they'll have a large impact on an emotional or psychological level for your drafters who will know they're going to be playing with these iconic cards.
Right, and I think that's actually an interesting thing to bring up about Cube in general, is playing with these cards that you don't normally get to play with. Like, especially if you're a newer player, you're usually playing standard, maybe EDH a bit, but you get to look at all of those like modern and legacy players, or even maybe some vintage players, and you go, it would be awesome if I could play stuff like that. And Cube is an outlet that allows you to play that pretty easily, and it's really fun, and it really strikes you on an emotional level, even if you don't notice it.
Yes, and I would say you will notice it. It's something you may not notice is missing until you have it, though.
Right, exactly.
I can still remember when my cube was new and we were the poor college kids sacrificing good food in exchange for booster packs of cards at Walmart. No experience with that.
No, definitely responsible adults.
Yes. But I can still remember how awesome it was when we opened up a pack and saw Trigon Predator for the first time, because at the time it was a cool card that I didn't have for a while. I picked it up for $2 or something, and it was a big deal to us that now I could draft Trigon Predator. Isn't he so cool? It's go for those things that are within your budget range that you know will get the hype out of your group. The iconic thing that they've been missing, whether it's super great or not, isn't really the point of this. It's what's going to get them excited.
Yeah. And I think that's even more necessary for a new cube, is to make sure that the excitement stays. Because if you stop that, so if you create your cube, you draft it a few times, there's excitement because it's new, it's something awesome and that you just did. But after a while, maybe it kind of starts waning a little bit if you haven't added anything from the new set, just because maybe it's too expensive or something like that. Adding stuff like this can actually really put that hype back in to the cube and make it enjoyable and fun and exciting again.
Another one for the hyper budgets is, I would say, Planeswalkers. Why in particular I would say Planeswalkers? It's a card type that you don't get access to on the hyper budget, like if you started with a CK cube or you started with the board game cube or something like that, where the entire cube costs less than 10 average Planeswalkers. It's just not something you had access to start with, but it's a core card type of Magic. And I wouldn't say you're supposed to be grabbing the top dogs. You don't need to grab a 4 or 6 drop Elspeth. You don't need to grab Jace the Mind Sculptor, but look for the more base level, just plain good Planeswalkers you'll be happy to see in a draft. Things like Jace Beleren. Everyone loves a Jace Beleren.
Yeah.
Garruk Wildspeaker, probably my favorite design Planeswalker of all time.
Yeah, definitely. They're cards that they're not really gonna break any format,
but they're always going to feel important.
Right. And that's weird because when you actually look at Planeswalkers, they're not anything special at like when you just actually look at it. They're just a non-creature. They're an enchantment that just kind of sticks around and it has some modes, but it feels special. It emotionally feels cool. Not entirely sure why. Maybe part of it's just because they've always been mythics other than the Lorben set. Maybe it's because the story of Magic actually matters and it feels cool that you're playing a story character. I don't know. There's any number of reasons that emotionally Planeswalkers could feel special, but they do. It just is part of it.
It's also that it's a core card type.
Yeah.
It's listed on other cards. It matters. There are things that say creatures are Planeswalkers. It suddenly adds a feeling of importance to the card that it's been missing from your format.
Right, like if you had Hero's Downfall, because it's a decent kill spell, now it has that it can kill Planeswalker, and that actually matters. And it feels like, oh, you've unlocked this hidden mode of the card that didn't exist before.
The other thing I would say budget cubes have to notice, when it comes to extending your budget, you're probably going to be spending it asymmetrically on the different archetypes available in your cube. For instance, the 12th best aggro creature and the 3rd best aggro creature are going to be nearly the same power level at this point in Magic's history.
Right.
And they're all going to cost about 20 cents because the only formats that care about the best aggro creatures only need to know what the best 2 or 3 are. They're only going to be spiking the price of Goblin Guide and such.
Right.
It doesn't matter that a card hasn't been printed in a decade if it was printed at common as just a 2-1 for 1. So your aggressive creatures are going to be cheap. Then we get into ramp creatures. You get a little bit of a weirder mix of commons like Llanowar Elves and those where you've got rares like Birds of Paradise will always be a few dollars. And then we get into control. Control cards classically cost a lot, especially when we get into the control finishers. I didn't say especially for once in my life. I want props for that.
Good job.
But when we get into the control finishers and stuff, and we get into the ramp targets, this is where we start seeing cards that cost a few bucks or cost $10. These are going to be your non-zero amounts of money.
Yeah.
The core cards in the form of board wipes and stuff for control as well don't exist at low rarities. They tend to be printed infrequently because having 20 of them available at any point in standard would be useless. But when we're looking at it from a cube standpoint, rarity doesn't matter unless you're running a specialized cube, in which case you know what you need and this episode's not for you.
Right.
But for a typical cube, rarity doesn't matter to us. The fact that Wrath of God and Damnation were only printed at rares infrequently doesn't matter to us compared to the fact that we've got 12 white 2/1s for 1 with a minor upside. The difference is those white 2/1s for 1 were printable in every format at common or uncommon. They wouldn't affect the draft format very much. So Wizards of the Coast didn't have to worry about limiting how many they were putting in there. The same isn't true with control cards. The same isn't true with ramp payoff targets. You don't want to open a pack and see 7, 8 drops. It's not going to make for fun limited format unless it's an incredibly warped one like Eldrazi.
Sure. The other thing is colorless cards. They don't really matter as much. To be honest, they're just support cards for everything else in the draft. You don't have to spend that much money on them. There are most of them that are like good are going to be really expensive because you can play them in everything.
Yes, I would say that's more the problem is they're going to fetch a much higher price for their impact because they lack the restrictions. So a very good artifact in any format is playable by everybody.
Right.
That makes the card always cost more money. That makes it harder on us when we've got a budget updating a cube to grab a colorless card where we go, wow, the same effect in the color this effect is normally from cost me 10 cents. This card is $50 because suddenly it gives blue access to an effect it shouldn't have or something like that.
Yeah, and that's kind of like, there's very few archetypes that are defined by colorless in specific. So back to the idea of like, you want to spend your money on the archetype defining cards. Well, if colorless doesn't really have that many of them, it's fine to just have it as the support to kind of prop up the rest of the draft.
And to a same extent, I would say utility lands.
Sure.
Utility lands tend to be, the ones that are good, tend to be high in cost because they get used a lot in the older formats especially.
Yeah, like Wasteland.
Yes. They're going to be a high cost to impact ratio that you don't really care about too much when you're early in your cube design. They're not going to hugely affect your cube unless you're going for something like a lands matters archetype, at which point you need to know that's what you're budgeting all your money for. Right. It might be a very expensive thing to try to add to your cube compared to the payoff you're going to get out of it, but you have to know that going into that update. But if you're just doing general early updates, I would skip things like utility lands for the most part because they're going to cost a lot of money for the ones that matter.
And the ones that don't really matter, who cares? Like, it's not going to add that much to the format usually. So
exactly. You're not going to want to draft a third-rate utility land that you're not really going to want to play in your deck anyway.
Right.
As one last note, I just want to say once again that we've said this a million times, Cube is an evolving format. It's a living format that you're constantly going to be making changes to. Don't get decision paralysis when it comes to an update. This isn't the last time you'll ever update your cube. You're going to do it again regularly from now on. It does suck if you feel like you wasted money because a card only lasted 3 months in your cube or 6 months.
Yeah, I think it's one of those that, like, when you make updates, you have to accept that sometimes those updates don't work out or they don't work out as you wanted it to, but there's plenty of times that they will.
Yes, and there's other times where they worked out fine, but it's time to move on.
Right.
We loved the Splinter Twin combo in my cube. We ended up taking it out because at a certain point we got bored of the combo and we wanted to move on to other things.
Yeah, and it does feel like, yeah, that was a bit of a waste, but at the same time...
You don't throw them in the shredder. You can always bring them back later.
Right. And if it didn't work out, well, now you know a little bit more about your cube, so you can have a better idea of going forward where you want to spend your money.
Right. So let's hit our outro and get you guys out of here for the week.
Sounds good.